Ladies and gentlemen, okay, so this is going to be our last class. Somebody said it was so surprising that we reached the end so quickly. And we thought we'd have a general discussion. We've covered a lot of material from the Depression, from the earlier crises, from ideas from characters whose names you've never heard of before, through Keynes, etc. What strikes, I'm going to give some comments, and then Roberto will make some comments, and then we'll open for some things. I'm just struck by every day when I pick up I don't pick up the newspaper, excuse me. When I go to the website, not paying for the newspapers, free, how amazingly linked to what we've been discussing everything is. Some places we may have been wrong about some of the stuff, maybe overly, right now thinking maybe we've been overly pessimistic about reforms, that there may be things happening in some domains at least that didn't seem they were going to be there. And then let me just make a funny comment. I'm thinking mostly now about the Goldman Sachs thing. People would say to me, "How are you feeling today? So how are you doing?" And I would say, "Oh, I don't feel so great, but I'm better than the U.S. economy." Now I can say, "I don't feel so great, but better than Goldman Sachs," except of course in the money pouring in to them. And then when you think, if you go to the kind of papers and things, this sort of transformation of suddenly saying, hey, we are going to get some financial regulation reforms, maybe a lot tougher than it looked a few weeks ago. Of course, it may again be it's very marginal. But then you sort of say, well, there was a 3-2 vote by the Securities and Exchange Commission to charge Goldman with fraudulent behavior towards people who were whose money they, in some sense, were responsible for. They're selling products to. That would be very strange if indeed on a 3-2 vote, the 3 Democrats versus 2 Republicans voted against indicting or bringing this charge against them. If that would in fact spark a serious reform, at least in the financial sector. And that to me says, my goodness, the thing is so fragile or so on edge, it's small event can suddenly turn the things that you've been reading the financial press, which I've been reading very diligently the last week, to see suddenly fairly conservative commentators suddenly saying things like, oh, we've always known everything Goldman has done has been, if not illegal, because I think they may get off on this particular thing, the lawyers with a better idea, this charge, but on the borderline of this, and certainly not moral. I've even had one of my students who's going to be working for Morgan Stanley come in and say, gee, at least it's not Goldman, so we're not doing that bad things. I said, well, just wait, and they start investigating and so on. So this is still an extremely, whatever the right word is. It's not turbulent, isn't quite the word. Unstable, possibilities, and I hope you keep paying attention to the news things and watching the changing views and the changing way people are behaving as something we didn't really deal with that much, and we didn't deal very much at all with that in the course. What it is that could possibly lead to greater reforms. There also was there's a footnote, an interesting item in today's paper, which said, who do you think was the biggest contributor to the Obama campaign? It was Goldman Sachs. So you sort of understand, oh my, if they were, how this was going to be, has to be affecting the way the way they behave. So in one sense, I think the course has touched on extremely live issues, and live issues that it's hard to know where they're all going to come out. That's maybe a sense of the weakness of social science. We still think, I've still been amazed by how the banks have managed to recover their position. They certainly recovered their money, giant sums of money being thing, but suddenly a lot of people, including fairly, I say, conservative, moderate type people, suddenly saying, wait a second, this isn't quite right. And if one charge, unproven in court for the SEC, is enough to have shifted public opinion and possibly administration policy dramatic way, that sort of says how unstable the situation is. That's something that just surprises me when you write your papers and so on. I hope you'll be, pay some attention to this. Possibilities may be bigger than we thought. Roberto.
Yeah. Just a few words to suggest in retrospect a view of both the ambitions and the limitations of the inquiry that we have tried to conduct here. I begin by describing three overlapping contrasts that have been recurrent themes in our arguments. And with respect to each of the three contrasts that I am now going to state, I take the second of the two positions. So the first contrast is the contrast between the view that the crisis is simply a threat, a shadow, an interruption, and the view that it is, in principle, an immense transformative opportunity that we risk squandering, if indeed we have not already largely wasted it. The second contrast is the contrast between two views of the position of finance. So one view is a major part of the problem lies in the power, the influence, and the abuses of the bankers or the financiers. The second position, which I defend, is that the financiers are on the whole simply poor devils whom we have allowed to become rich. The problem does not lie in the power and the abuses and the influence of finance, but in our ideas about finance and in the ideas that we have allowed to control the evolution of the economic and social world. The third contrast is the contrast between two discourses that one can have about the problems and the opportunities of the crisis. The first discourse says the flaw lies in localized market imperfections, having to do, for example, with moral hazard or asymmetric information or systemic risk. The second discourse says the problem is not in these localized defects within the established institutional framework, but rather in the institutional framework itself, including the institutional arrangements that govern the relation between finance and the real economy. Therefore, we should see the localized defects as simply the episodic manifestations of a more general problem and a more general opportunity. Now, clearly, these three contrasts that I've just cited are all partly interlocking or overlapping. And to take the first or the second position with respect to any one of the three of them makes it much more likely that you will take the first or the second with respect to the other two. Now I make a second remark. What is the obstacle in pursuing the second position in each of these three debates that I have just enumerated? There are two main difficulties. One intellectual or theoretical, and the other political or programmatic. The intellectual difficulty is the poverty of the ideas that inform the present worldwide debate about the crisis. On the one hand, we witness the attempt to resuscitate a mummified and shrunken Keynesianism. The practical side of the Keynesian prescriptions seems peculiarly inapposite to the circumstances of a so-called balance sheet recession. A slump provoked in part by a pseudo-democratization of credit in major economies of the world. And the theoretical apparatus of Keynesianism seems entirely inadequate to the task of exploring institutional alternatives to the organization of the market economy in particular, and the reshaping of the relation between finance and the real economy in particular. On the other hand, there have also been a series of initiatives in the world to promote alternative economic thinking. For example, the French government has established an institution supposedly to encourage a counterweight to the dominant tendencies of Anglo-American economics. And a number of would-be progressive philanthropists and agitators like, for example, George Soros, have gathered together the self-appointed champions of the alternative economic thinking. And it is astonishing to see that, in fact, when these people congregate, what prevails in their discourse on the whole is exactly the first of the two positions in each of the three debates that I enumerated. So they have no basis on which to claim to represent an alternative. There is a striking theoretical weakness that is preventing our advance toward the second position in each of the three debates. Now I mention the second general difficulty in providing a strong ground for the second position in each of the three debates, and that is the political or programmatic difficulty. What, in general, is the position of the progressives in the contemporary world? It is the position of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. They have become the people who bring the sugar in the double form of redistribution and regulation. But humanity doesn't want sugarcoating. Humanity wants reconstruction and alternatives, which they fail to provide. Their leitmotif has become the humanization of the inevitable. In general, we see that there are two main forms of the progressive or leftist position established in the world today. The first form is a a surrendered, humanizing progressivism. It accepts the market economy in its present form and globalization on its present course, and seeks to humanize them, or to attenuate their dangers through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, and through regulation. The second form of the left or progressive position in the world is a recalcitrant left. It has no alternative to the market economy in its present form or to globalization in its present course, and it simply wants to limit them or to slow them down, usually in defense of the interests of its historical constituency, especially the organized labor force headquartered in the declining capital-intensive sectors of industry. What the world needs and lacks is a third reconstructive left that would refuse to take the market economy and globalization on a take-it-or-leave-it basis, and would propose to reorganize the market economy in its institutional content in the service of socially inclusive economic growth, and to redirect the course of globalization so that globalization becomes a friend rather than an enemy to democratic experimentalism. Now we could discuss.
Yes. Do you want me to say something? We're anticipating you will have something to say. And so who wants to be the first person to say something? Yes, sir.
I'll just start off maybe with the idea of democratic experimentalism, or maybe with economic experimentalism more generally. We read a few things in the course about the state of academic economics today, and you've said a few things comparing it to physics, for example, the split between theoretical and experimental. I just keep wondering, and I don't even know exactly which questions to ask because I know so little about how these economics departments function, but I wonder how we could encourage experimentalism among the people who know the technical detail. Like Professor Unger said, there are a lot of visionaries out there that don't know technical economics, and there are a lot of people who know the technical detail but don't have a great vision. Just maybe to start it off, I found myself wondering, what was it, Taleb who talked about the different quadrants and how through his practical experience in life, he had found that the mathematical statistical models worked in certain quadrants, didn't work in others, and he kind of thematized that. I wonder, could that be made a part of the economics education, learning the mathematical models, but actually forcing everyone to study the extent to which they do and do not apply in the real world? Is anything like that required right now? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, certainly people know that models have failed. Probably the most useful thing is to study economic history, which is required in some departments, not in others. To not do the economic history means not to know the subject matter, the material that you have to understand. And the minute you do that, you do see, of course, dramatic changes and failures and so on. Let me give a funny answer. If you take certain kind of machine learning algorithms, they're called data streaming mining, or data stream mining. What they try to do is you get some evidence comes in and you want to quickly understand when you're in a different world than you thought you were in. It turns out the best models that they have able to do this are models that have a wide diversity of views. Meaning in the following: you don't pick the models that always were very good over a certain period of time. And let's think about economics. You had this great moderation, and then people all jumped on and they pushed aside anybody who thought this wasn't the future of the world. That the world was just becoming more whatever it is. In this machine learning kind of thing, that's absolutely, and they can show you example after example where it doesn't work. If there's going to be a world where things change, then you always want to have a very diverse set of ideas, because some of the people who buy into, let's say, the real business cycles, the rational expectations, it's awfully hard for them to change their views. But if you also have alternative views being given, and the way they do this in the machine learning, you have a set of algorithms that are supposed to be predicting what the next event is going to look like. Of course, algorithms that are based on the future looking like the past are going to do pretty well for a certain period. Then something dramatic is going to happen, which is Taleb's kind of thing. And suddenly those models are terrible, and you're blind. You don't know what you're doing. This is the idea issue that Roberto talked about, having this weakness of ideas. Well, the way to be prepared is to have in your, they call them ensembles of models, some models that are negatively correlated with the majority of models before. They can't be things that were utterly and utterly wrong, because then you have the person who comes in and says, I can square the circle, or I can make energy costlessly, or something that may not even meet the laws of physics, something like that. But this whole essence of this kind of thinking, or this kind of analysis, is that you need negatively correlated views. What economics has done by creating a very strong mainstream is ruled out those other views at a time when they could be very useful. And so I'm not sure you can get society or things. You think of the president's advisors. They are all from what Roberto called the progressive humanizing group. Actually, some of them are not even from that group. The best are from that group. that's. And what you really want to have for making good decisions, I think, is to have this spread. So, because the people with one mindset will not see certain things until it all explodes in their face. They will just downplay, and you can go back and you can say, Greenspan, Rubin, Summers, when we did some of the derivative stuff, they could not see the value of this. And at that point, it was, I suppose, Clinton and the Democratic Party. Had they listened to, they did have some alternative views. They didn't listen to them. So it's somehow the strengthening that, and it could be in a time when you may have a majority of people thinking in a more, quote, progressive liberal way. You want to keep some conservatives there to speak out, because they're going to see some things about reality.
But I take it, Richard, that part of the reach of this question is whether there are features of the professional organization of academic economics and the formation of economists that systematically suppress the emergence of alternatives.
If I could ask a follow-up along those lines,
Yeah.
You have sketched a compelling argument for including a plurality of views as a safeguard against unexpected things that defy the mainstream view. And that was part of my question. Another part is what Professor Unger just asked, though, how things could be changed in any way to encourage the development of new views. And one thought that comes to mind, do you think there would be any value in requiring more practical experience of some kind? For example, I just read that Muhammad Yunus had, I think, gotten a finance or an economics PhD at Vanderbilt, returned to, is it Bangladesh or India, I forget which, and just found that what he had learned didn't quite apply to what he was seeing on the ground. People could not get loans, and that was the inspiration for the microfinance idea.
So, I mean, if the charge is that the economics as a discipline has become extraordinarily academic, to where people come, you do your undergraduate training, you move to your graduate training, you become an assistant professor, and you never have any experience or knowledge of the outside world. I think that's a fair and reasonable charge to make. Probably the place where that has been most undermined has been development economics. And literally all the people who work in development economics are spending time on the ground in various countries, and that includes graduate students and so on. And so development economics has always been a much more diverse area. The place where it's been the least has clearly been in I think of it as high theory, where people are spending a lot of time learning mathematical techniques to prove that the market works always, and to ignore any evidence the other way, which is the string theory kind of a perspective. I just assume, I can't be sure, that this crisis is going to cause quite a bit of change. And where it's got to come from, though, is from the current crop of graduate students or future crop of graduate students who will, by their voting with their feet, the classes and topics that they do. I think the history of ideas is that it very rarely happens among the senior established figures who will go on, many of them, not all of course, but doing the same things. If you go back to the Harvard economics department, as just a typical Harvard department, there were very few Keynesian discussions for years and years. There was a department that we said was predicting the end of the great the crash. The prosperity was always around the corner, and then they finally just gave up making predictions because they were so wrong. And that was the department that maintained itself, but it was by the replenishment of new people. So I think a lot of these things are hinges on who writes the theses and who then gets promoted in the change. A change occurs that way. It rarely occurs among older people suddenly standing up and saying, I was wrong about everything. Because they rarely were wrong about everything. They just looked at this part of the world, that's the part I know, and that's why the diversity in the first stage is absolutely critical. You got to have people who are looking like this, people who are looking like that, etc.
But what is frightening is not the orthodoxy of the old. What is frightening is the orthodoxy of the young. And
now we need the young to speak.
Those who become old while still young. And so I would like to say a few words about this phenomenon in relation to economics. Now, first, to put some flesh on the bones of the idea of the systematic deficiencies of the mainstream of economics, I remind you of my argument at various moments in the course that the main line of thinking is deficient in at least three fundamental respects, none of which, by the way, is present in these discussions of the supposed alternatives. So the first is the influence, the long-standing influence of the marginalist revolution in placing the analytic core of economics in the direction of a strategy of invulnerability. So a pure method of analysis in which the empirical and normative starting points are supplied from the outside as stipulations, so that it is always possible for the analytically pure economist to say, don't blame me. I just took whatever normative and empirical assumptions you provided me with. Now, this was not the nature of classical economics. Classical economics was a causal theory, and at the same time a set of normative propositions. Adam Smith, Ricardo, Karl Marx, and so forth. We see departures from this in the direction of ideology or in the direction of equivocation, but we see no clear alternative to it. Then comes the second deficiency, which is the vacuum of institutional imagination. To the extent that contemporary economics has attempted to overcome the limitations of this strategy of analytical vacuity and invulnerability, it has done so in the behavioral and psychological direction, rather than in the institutional direction. And Keynes himself, in some respects, radicalized the psychologism of traditional English political economy. And the third systematic deficiency is the failure to have a genuine theory of the creation of the diverse stuff on which the mechanism of competitive selection operates. So I claimed it's like half of Darwinism. Half of it is missing. Now, some remarks about the way in which these limitations are and are not confronted in the present situation. I want to give two examples. One is Keynes himself, and the other is development economics, mentioned now by Richard Freeman, and especially the development economics of the 1960s and 1970s. So, Keynes. Keynes's occasional writings, his essays, his speeches, his newspaper articles of the 1920s and 1930s are in many respects deeper, more philosophical, more profound, and more subversive than his theoretical writing, than the writing of the general theory. He considered a number of different ways of understanding the slump of the 1930s, and a number of different responses, including different ways in which the state might assume partial control or influence over the investment decision. And he clearly fixed on the support for aggregate demand for practical and strategic reasons. That is to say, he considered that the other alternatives in the European setting of his time would be viewed as leftist or statist. And he himself, Keynes, would be tarred with the brush of leftism and painted into a corner. And of course, Keynes was a very worldly man who wanted to shine. He didn't want to be admired by posterity. He wanted to influence during his own life. And he chose the premise, the predicate, which he viewed as more politically palatable. So the premise of the general theory is chosen for pre-theoretical reasons, which are not themselves theorized. It's as if it were the theory of a special case. And this has practical relevance today because it may turn out that this special case renders the theoretical apparatus that he constructed relatively inapposite to the circumstances of a balance sheet recession. So the strategic calculus imposes a theoretical price that turns out much later on to have practical implications. Now, what's the deep root of this problem? What's the point of this example of Keynes? It's that we all in some way desire and should desire to be both insiders and outsiders. But it is vital to the power of thought and to the service that it renders humanity that it should not become simply the instrument of a strategizing calculus. We have to try and discover the truth, whether it's convenient or not in the circumstances of our own lives. Now take the example of development economics in the 1960s and 70s. Development economics, as Richard Freeman has just said, has been one of the terrains for trying out alternatives to this main line of economic thinking. But the most famous development economists of the 1960s and 70s, to take this safer example of people who are now either very old or already dead, they were very cautious. And so they presented their work on the whole as variations, as elaborations, as enrichments, rather than as an open defiance of the theoretical corpus. And it is, in a sense, a strategy of peaceful coexistence and intellectual survival. So their work is allowed to exist alongside because it's not presented as a threat. But maybe this strategy of short-term survival helps explain why then in the medium and long term it withers on the vine. It doesn't become the point of departure for an alternative theoretical project. And once again, we have in another form the very interesting relation between the epistemological problem of creating alternatives and the moral problem of paying the price of defiance in one's own time and one's own circumstance. So it's obviously very hard to solve this problem. There's a practical side. It's not just an epistemological issue, as you have correctly suggested. A young economist comes through the ranks, and he's terrified. He has to master the corpus. He has to please his elders. He can't do things that seem to go off the deep end. And everything has to be filtered through a series of methods that make the work look respectable. But there isn't a complete dissociation between form and content. So the question is, once you have done everything that you need to do over a period of many years to demonstrate that you have mastered the rules of this established system, will you still be able to defy and to overcome? I'm not saying that there's a clear answer to that question. I'm saying that there's a complicated situation in which the powers of the imagination are held hostage by the scarcity of a vital resource, courage, the enabling virtue, the virtue without which all other virtues become sterile.
We had two other complications. Because one of a former graduate student of mine who basically said he's getting old enough now that he's getting worried about the young people. I said, well, oh my God, what does that say for me? And I said, well, why do you say this? He said, because the way you really make your name in economics and almost any science is by overturning some things the older generation said and did. So I think that to view the younger group of the best way you can do something is you say something Paul Samuelson did is wrong, and this is why it's wrong. You've got fame and immediately. And the most imaginative and creative people are indeed, looking to make that kind of a hit. It's not like it's a priesthood where you do this. You establish yourself by doing something very unique and new. And so there's huge rewards to that. Those are risky. They're risky because if you say do something new, maybe it's going to be wrong. That's always possible. And then there's risk, obviously, you will lose some champions of a kind. But there still is huge rewards. People will sit down, and I'm sure this is true, not economics, it's got to be true of all social science departments, and they will say, who has done the most innovative, path-breaking, ... work when they come to make appointments. And so it's a tension there. Then I'll make another comment, because I think one of the problems with, let's call it, Roberto called it, I wrote down it, third stream of progressive thought beyond the humanitarian thought, is that we had, and some of it stemmed from the classical economists. We had Marxism, and we saw what it did to Russia, to China, to East Europe. That clearly drew people back from being too imaginative. You might have said the Marxist thing, there wasn't imaginative enough about what the world they were trying to create is. But nonetheless, we saw that. And so that has to have made some boundaries. Hopefully, the current disaster with unfettered financial markets is going to make clearer the boundaries in that direction. Now that's going to push everything to some middle-ish kind of a thing. You might have said, well, those two extremes are too extreme, but certainly the unfettered capitalist financial market thing has been something we've gone down very, very far down that, and that's now spit up at us. I also don't have the same warm feelings towards the classical economists as you do, I think. We had the prediction we were going to run out of resources and the population was going to increase more rapidly. There was nothing in those analyses that predicted people cutting down the number of children as they got wealthier. There was some good things said, but it wasn't that was a superior, vision of the world.
No, in content, no. But the question is how we can recreate economics as a discipline that does not cling to this strategy of invulnerability to empirical and normative controversy. Obviously, not by just repeating the substance of the doctrines of the classical economists. And just on the question of the political or programmatic debate, another way of saying the same thing is that in the rich North Atlantic democracies, the horizon of programmatic debate has now become largely confined to the project of reconciling American-style economic flexibility with European-style social protection and governmental regulation within the horizon of the established institutions. And we still live under the influence of the hydraulic model of ideological controversy. More market, less state, more state, less market. And then we think, well, the only solution is to split the difference. A little bit of market and a little bit of state. And that's what we have.
Yeah. We had another.
Professor Unger, I think it was in the course trailer that you said, never waste a crisis, or at least you were quoting Emmanuel when he said, never waste a crisis. And it seems that this crisis is wasted from the perspective that you're coming from, in that sort of the reforms, the financial reform package maybe accomplishes the first contrast, but certainly doesn't do anything for the second one. So do you think then that, sort of we're done for like about 20 or 80 years till the next big crisis happens? Or do you think like there's actually, and maybe now is the time to work on incremental changes rather than dramatic changes, because that opportunity for dramatic change is actually gone? Or do you think that in fact there is actually still an opportunity for dramatic change? And if you think that this opportunity still exists, how do you think that the public opinion or the democratic process can be brought about in a way such that this opportunity still exists?
Well, first, I think the opportunity still exists. I think it still exists because the limitations of the fiscal stimulus, for the reasons we explored, are such that it is unlikely to provide in major economies of the world a sustained and socially broad-based recovery. This domestic or national problem will be combined with the persistence of these major structural imbalances in the world. So the horizon, the agenda of the crisis will remain open. And we should not wait, we need not wait for the next great trauma. But now I want to make a second remark that has to do with your implied contrast between incremental change and dramatic change. I don't accept that contrast, and I don't accept that contrast for the following reason. The dominant intellectual tradition in social thought for the last 150 years has associated deep change with systemic change, that is, the wholesale substitution of one system for another, as in Marxism. And then it has also associated fragmentary, piecemeal, cumulative change with modest change. But this is entirely false. In fact, there aren't these big indivisible systems like so-called capitalism. And on the whole, structural change does not happen in history in the form of these big systemic substitutions. The exemplary form of structural change is what you could call radical reform. The piecemeal substitution of institutional and conceptual presuppositions. A practice or a method that is gradualist and piecemeal can nevertheless have a radical outcome if it persists cumulatively in a certain direction, animated by a conception. And that's what I believe in as a method.
I have a question with regards to volatility in finance, specifically international relations or international finance, and how regimes, we can create a regime to reduce this international volatility. I think one of the lectures dealt with not having sort of a lender of last resort or one large institution like the IMF, but rather a series of rules or conventions which countries would allow. So I was curious to know is how this specifically would work, and if you could you could talk about that more.
Or it's a question about the alternative monetary arrangements, is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, because I think the central premise of the argument was that international finance is inherently volatile, and we need to curb this volatility. But one of the ways to do it is have institutional. No.
Are you referring to an argument I made?
Yeah.
No. So at one point in dealing with the strategy of regulatory dualism and the nature of finance, I presented a set of arguments saying, finance operates in an institutional context. This institutional context is productive of many forms of instability, which cannot be controlled from within the horizon of professional finance, and are on the whole barely visible from within that horizon. And one of those sources of instability is what I call international anarchy. Ever since the collapse of the original Bretton Woods regime in August of 1971, there hasn't been any generally organized system in the world to deal with the contradictions of the so-called trilemma of macroeconomics. And that has in turn served as one of the permissive conditions for the creation of these massive structural imbalances of deficits and surpluses in the world. This idea appeared in different contexts. It appeared first in the discussion of finance, and then it reappeared in the discussion of globalization. in the discussion of globalization, I took the position that we need not return to Keynes's original proposal, which was to have a very heavy-handed international bureaucratic system that prevented the creation of large-scale surpluses. If we are committed to the maximum degree of pluralism in the construction of the world economy, we should want the international monetary arrangements to be as simple and as mechanical as possible, and to minimize the delegation of discretionary power to any international bureaucracy. And then I gave an example of such a system, of saying that if a certain economy reaches a certain threshold of surplus, defined by a combination of absolute and relative criteria, it could be required for its engagement in the world trading system, for example, to float its currency. There are a whole set of solutions that wouldn't require us to adopt a heavy-handed bureaucratic discretionary apparatus.
Professor Unger, a lot of the arguments that you presented were related to linking finance to the real productive agenda of society. And I guess implicit in that argument was that the financial services that we provide are not a part of the productive agenda of society. So I guess I'm wondering what would constitute a productive societal project, and why would financial services or any kind of service provision not be fitting within a productive system?
You want to speak to this first?
Yeah, I suppose I could say something. Consider what a productive service would be from finance. I loan money to you to invest in a business. The alternative is I run all kinds of gambling games. They could be called credit default swaps or whatever you want. And the bulk of my activity is not finding out which businesses or which houses or people I should give mortgages to. It's running something where it's so internalized. One of the striking things about the system has been that basically the money, let's just think about for right now, the banks just come back with huge sums of money. Do we see investment going out? No. Actually, the amount of bank loans for investment purposes is probably the least it's ever been in our history. Almost all of current investment is coming out of retained earnings. The banks are doing nothing. So what are they doing? Why are they making huge sums of money? What they're doing is, and I assume this would fit into your thing, they're borrowing money from the US Treasury at extraordinarily low rates. Then they're buying Treasury bonds that pay higher amounts, and they're making money. I could make as much money, you could make as much money as Goldman Sachs does by doing the same kind of operation. So that is not a productive agenda. We gave them very low Treasury borrowings so that they make investments or give money to businesses in the real economy. That's not showing up. It's very, yeah, they'll buy US bonds, they'll offer various risky investment vehicles that they're coming back. That's why the hedge funds made gigantic sums of money. Be clear, in this period, we still have 9 point, whatever it is, % unemployment. We are still at a very fragile point of time. We probably have the most profitable banking system we've ever had. That if that isn't a disconnect between the real economy and the finance sector that says they are not doing what we want a finance sector to do, which is loan money to new and growing businesses. I mean, it's striking. I don't know and I have to be the history of this, where we've ever before have had an economy that is fragile, weak, and with joblessness promised for the next 5 years at the long period of time, and the banking sector making more money than they have ever made before. If the Treasury were to raise the amount they're loaning to them, they would not be making as much money as they're currently making. They are still living off U.S. taxpayers, and they're just raking it in. That is not a productive banking sector, and it's probably destructive to the future economy of this country.
So, just following up on that, the basic idea is, under the current arrangements, not just in the United States, but in the world generally, in market economies as they are now organized, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of firms. And the vast amount of capital concentrated in the banks and the stock market seems to have a relation that is either episodic or oblique to the funding of production. So, an example of an oblique relation, initial public offerings. That's a clear link to the financing of production, but it's a tiny part of the activities of the capital markets. In fact, with the buybacks in many periods, this equity contribution has been negative. So then the question comes, what's the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? And then the second question, does it have to be this way? And the underlying thesis of this part of the argument is that the relation of finance to the real economy is not invariant, but susceptible to variation in the light of different institutional arrangements. In particular, the institutional arrangements that govern the relation of finance to production. Now we have a difficulty. The first difficulty is terminological, because the categories established under the national accounting system, in part as a result of the influence of Keynes and his disciples, makes it difficult even to formulate the problem, given the terminological equation of aggregate investment with aggregate savings. This is then aggravated by the Keynesian thesis that investment is, that saving is much more the effect than it is the cause of investment. So it requires a series of theoretical moves and of changes in terminology to be able even to discuss this problem, and then to open an agenda of debates about the alternative institutional arrangements in a series of domains. Example of such a domain, the vast amount of saving accumulated in the pension systems of the world. How is it that part of that capital could be used to do the work of venture capital, investment in startup and innovative enterprise?
And I think that idea is probably one of the chief, most exciting ideas I think you have, Professor Unger. Kind of a follow along of what he asked. In its best light, I think the CDO market and all the mortgage-backed security market was, in an indirect way, hooking up super cash, sovereign wealth funds, hedge funds, private equity funds, pension funds, and tying that through an indirect manner into the building of houses that people couldn't afford. So there's some productive maybe aspect to what was going on there. I mean, my wife's family in New Orleans, they were excited that the lumber industry was what it was, that they were building new houses, and and the mechanism through which that was enabled was through super levered CDO structures. All right, so it was, I think finance in its best light was tying a little bit, or at least trying to tie in pension fund money retirement fund money, sovereign wealth fund money, super cash into some type of real economy aspect. So we'd just like to hear more about. I understand why the hedge funds and why the pension funds began to participate in the MBS market, in the mortgage-backed security market, because the structured products being issued were not completely understood, and the returns on investment were pretty high for buying CDO tranches, and so it was enticing for them to participate. But as we consider bringing pension funds into venture capital investment, I'm just wondering exactly how do you entice, because I think one of the main problems you have to come to terms with is that modern finance is not dealing with the aggregate of a bunch of mom and pops saving accounts. We're dealing with increased inequality, all-time aggregation of wealth, a lot of U.S. dollars sitting in the hands of a few people. So in tying those types of groups and funds into venture capital, how do you make that enticing? How do you make that investment interesting?
Yeah, interesting to whom?
Well, I mean, so the hedge funds are just answering to the people that have entrusted them with their money. They're telling their investors, okay, I'll give you 20, 30+% returns. How do you systematically introduce those types of funds to venture capital? Yeah.
I mean, let's be clear. There's going to be a lot of people arrested for the mortgage-backed security things. And there'll be a lot of people hiring lawyers just to keep from being arrested. There was a huge criminal activity here. And you can go and quote the people saying, hey, do you want a fancy house? Let's just lie a little bit on your statistics, and we'll give you a mortgage because we're going to sell it to the guys over there. So the notion that somehow or other that entire endeavor was largely about providing houses for a few people is just absolutely wrong.
No, but I agree that the banks didn't have that in mind, and I agree the hedge funds didn't have that in mind.
That's right.
But there is an aspect to it that the two are connected because of the crazy mechanisms.
Well, the crazy incentives or mechanisms.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's correct. But the problem comes when you leverage up because you make lots of money, and then when you don't have regulators or any, I'll be very on the first side of this on this one, you don't have regulators, you don't have anybody standing there, and you don't have anybody in any of the banks or almost no one standing up and saying, wait a second, we know these balloon mortgages are going to go very quickly. And you got quotes of these guys, everybody says, we all know these are liars' loans. That's their term, not mine. So you have, I think, a natural process of greed operating. I see huge sums of money. I cut corners. Then I cut corners more. Then I cut corners more. And the society's got to step in and do something to prevent the normal operation of the greed. I read the greed is there. You tell me 20% and I don't ask any question, and it's a Ponzi scheme of a different sort. It's a Ponzi scheme maybe because there are some houses out there, but boy, the people aren't going to be able to pay for them. So I think there's been a major component of this, and we're going to just see more and more of this coming out, that this was breaking, if not legal things. A lot of it was illegal, and that's why we'll see more of this. And I want to remember the suspicious activity reports of the FBI throughout this period, unacted on by any of the Bush administration or the Obama. It was all over by that time, but they were zooming up. So banks were reporting odd transactions going on all over the place. Nobody doing anything about it. I don't think you can expect these people to say, no, I'm not going to try to make million, 10 million, whatever amount of money that they could make. They're going to do that. It is up to the society and the rest of us to say, wait a second, exactly how are you making this? And it wasn't just, the economists may have not raised any things. The financial press was, we make a big thing. Guy made X million dollars. Bob Rubin made $100 million, partly destroying Citicorp in the end. He's still on the Harvard board of trustees, or he's the chairman or something like that. So in one level, the whole society has a major role to play in policing and maintaining a sector that always, because there's so much money involved, is likely to go off, off the edge. We played with thinking it could be self-regulating. It can't. And I mean, good. Some people made some money doing lumber stuff, but the booms go on, and the boom gets very excited. At the top of the boom, it's very hard for somebody to say, stop. This is going to lead to a disaster, until the disaster occurs, and everybody says, you idiot, Alan Greenspan, why didn't you say stop? You were the guy who was supposed to have done some of that. So partly the questions of building in systemic changes, so we do get some greater accountability and operation. And let me be clear also, throughout this period, we had a huge boom in the dot-coms where the venture capital money came in. A lot of the dot-coms went bad, and the venture capital guys lost money. But real businesses came out. And we have Amazon, we have eBay, we have lots and lots of, now 9% of US sort of retail trade is now on the internet. It was zero before the dot-com explosion, essentially. Something came out of that. From this, aside from jail cells, for some bankers, I don't see what's the positive thing that's come out.
I would just say a lot of houses. I mean, maybe the people shouldn't be in the houses, but a lot of poor people got a lot of houses they couldn't afford.
I think the foreclosures that are going on are saying a lot of people are out of houses. You're going to see more homelessness in this country. You're not seeing a lot of people in houses. And if you go to Detroit and some of these cities, you will see the housing stock degenerating. And so there had been a house that I sold to Roberto. He's now can't pay. And do you think the banks are going there and keeping up the house? No, it's Arizona. Go take a look. I've got pictures of these things. So when you have a disaster like this, it's sort of like saying, okay, yeah, we build the houses, but we didn't build in any fire protection, and now there are a bunch of guys who see they make more money by burning the house down because they got credit default swaps saying that those mortgages are going bad. And that's whether we just got Morgan Stanley, whether legal or illegal, doing that. Now AIG is suddenly saying, wait, they were running credit default swaps against our stuff. This was exactly the non-productive aspect of finance. This was a thing, how do I make money ripping off anybody? And then my defense is this, it's caveat emptor. You're supposed to be smart. If I sell you something and it ultimately destroys you, so you can't live in your house, you can't pay. What, didn't you read the fine clause on the balloon mortgage? Weren't you smart enough to know that if you've got a very low income, you shouldn't be putting under a house of this size or magnitude? Well, you may say, well, I had the house for 2 years. Then the balloon mortgage came, and now I and my family are out. The house is a disaster. The foreclosures are still going up today.
I wasn't talking about the reactive effect, but in its best light to get there, you were putting a lot of people in houses.
But it's part of. You see, it's part of the same process. You have this.
It is part of the same process, but
if
there was any character to the situation, you wouldn't have the after. You wouldn't have the.
But you wouldn't have had the. I mean, one of the things that Minsky has, you have these giant booms, excesses build up. Somebody's got to try to stop the excesses. When the society just says, go, run with your excesses, you're going to get the crash. That has to be. You leverage up massively, the slightest thing, bang, you collapse. And if that certainly is a lesson everybody has drawn from this. You cannot have a boom where people are leveraged up extraordinarily, where they're selling crooked mortgages, they're peddling them, they're losing the. I would be more favorable to small mom and pop things, where in fact the Cambridge Trust Company knows the businesses it's loaning money to, and so it has some sort of a knowledge base about those loans. Some of these big banks didn't care. They don't know where the house is. They don't care. Mortgage brokers, give me some mortgages because I can peddle them to people over here. It's true. The people over here want the 20% return. So it's not like the big banks are, they're meeting a market demand. But it's kind of like you got teenagers coming in trying to buy liquor. Sell it to them. Sell it to them because I'm a liquor store and that's what I do.
So there are two forces that are the source of this phenomenon and that are converging. One is this detachment of finance from the real economy. So there is an underlying real transaction, but at some point, instead of becoming the subject matter, it becomes the pretext. And then there's a layering of successive financial transactions that become more and more distant from the underlying real transaction. So that's the first force. And then there's the second enabling force, without which this also wouldn't occur, which is what I call the pseudo-democratization of credit, which how do you sustain a market in mass consumption goods without real redistribution of income and wealth? You make this leveraging enabled in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral to take the place, to serve as the functional surrogate for the redistribution of income and wealth. It doesn't take place. And so these two forces have converged and produced the phenomenon about which we're speaking. But I want to focus for a moment on the other aspect of your remark, which is the question of the alternatives. Always in this attempt to open up a pathway that is gradualist in its steps, but can nevertheless be radical in its outcome, we have to begin from what exists, from the situation in which we find ourselves. And I simply point out certain features of the American situation, shared or not by other countries. If they don't have these, they have others, that could serve as starting points for such a reconstruction. So one of them is the vast amount of money in the pension system, a public pension system, a so-called defined benefit system. You don't need to think of privatizing it. You can imagine, in principle, placing even a small portion of that capital in a range of competitive, diversified, professionally managed funds that would do the work of venture capital. It would be public-private. It wouldn't be the use of the state to suppress the market or replace the market. It's the use of the power of the state to create a new kind of market, as Americans did many times before in their history, especially in the 19th century organization of finance and of agriculture. And historically, the returns have been very high to this kind of investment. And the solution to risk is diversification and competition. Now, a second starting point, and one of the great resources of the United States, is the remarkable system of local banks created in the 19th century. Banks that were created largely to put credit at the service of the local producer, not simply the local consumer. So the issue is, how could that resource be tapped and become a device for the lifting up of small and medium-sized firms throughout the country to a higher level, closer to the vanguard of innovation, of so-called post-Fordist production? And that is in turn related to a third resource in the situation, a resource specifically created by the New Deal, the so-called GSEs, the government-sponsored enterprise. Example, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae. They were created specifically in the housing area, but you can imagine analogous institutional devices of quasi-state organizations created in many domains. For example, for the purpose of working with the local banks so that they could do on a massive scale the work of venture capital.
Yeah.
Senator, how the market views form. Do you think there are some certain countries today that have started going in that way, or that would prove as some sort of example or model for the U.S. to learn from? I remember Professor Raymond mentioned Sweden as a sort of example for
That's a good
No,
question.
no, I don't think if you're, I don't think, in particular, I don't think that any existing contemporary society is the wave of the future. And I do not sympathize and do not believe in a style of thinking such as Marxist thinking that sees certain classes as anointed by history to play the role of the vanguard at a particular moment. I don't think that's the way things work. So we discussed, for example, the relative success of the BRICS in responding to the crisis. And I raised the question, do they show the way for the rest of the world? And my argument was, we can learn from their experience, but on the whole, they do not show the way. What they have done is to appeal to a series of shortcuts. Example of a shortcut. They have large development banks. For example, Brazil has a development bank which is much larger than the World Bank. And they are able then to instruct these development banks to do a forced distribution of credit that may or may not be associated as well with access to advanced technology and practice. But that's better than nothing. But it's not a substitute for the fundamental work of reshaping the market economy in the service of broadened opportunity and inclusion. Are we finished?
No, well, we're almost finished.
Just going back to the venture capital idea, I'm a little confused by, I guess, attaching pension funds to a venture capital form of investment, just in the sense that VC has had a lot of risk associated with it, and also lower returns, especially in recent years. So, like, I don't know what your thought is of using other people's money to fuel a form of investment that may be risky and not in the interest of those.
It's an empirical question. The issue is, what's the historical rate of return? And to what extent is diversification the sufficient antidote to risk? I wasn't thinking, actually, of private pension funds, teachers' pension funds. I was thinking of the capital in the pension funds of the state, Social Security, the defined benefit systems of the world. That's a vast amount of capital. If even a tiny part of that capital, a small part, were placed experimentally under a range of diversified forms of management, we would develop some experience with a very limited amount of exposure to see what the result is. Basic point is this. In principle, the work of venture capital should be central to the job of finance in a contemporary economy. What could be more important than channeling part of the saving of society into investment in emergent and innovative enterprise? In fact, it's minuscule, even in the United States, where it's much bigger than anywhere else.
We have some pension funds that have done various things, and some of them have lost money. It is risky. CalPERS made a lot of investments in California, some in real estate areas, and they lost a lot of money, and they're backing off from those kind of things. They did a lot of private equity deals. The TIA CREF, which is the professor's pension fund, which is huge also, has also done some things and hasn't done as badly as CalPERS has. So that. The Canadian, the Ontario Teachers Fund has done quite well. So there's a mixed experience. I would have phrased the thing, 'cause I agree with you that for what you think of as genuine venture capital, I don't think these are the right people to do it. But where they can be very useful is often the signal that a company is doing has some chances is when a private venture capital firm has put some money in. And we actually got a study going on which says if you have a bunch of innovative firms trying new technologies in the energy area, something like that, you first have the venture capital come in from a genuine sort of risk-taking group that can afford to lose the money because it's wealthier people's money and that's fine. And then once they put the money in, then you could see a follow-up set of funds coming in because they have done the diligent work of sort of trying to discern which are good or bad. I have a feeling that the state funds, remember the New York pension fund, Mr. Hevesy, I don't know if he's in prison yet or not, but he was convicted of taking bribes on things. One of the virtues of the private venture capital things, it's the guy's own money. So it's unlikely they're going to make a bad investment by taking a bribe. Not to say some huge venture capital fund that, might, but if it's real venture capitalists, it's people putting largely their own money or money of a small group. So, but then to have the follow up with the pension funds coming in and doing things, possibly working with the venture capital people in some fashion, that makes more sense. I said we got a study going on trying to see if that, in fact, to what extent that has occurred. Because if I'm a big pension fund and I see some very wealthy, successful venture capitalist putting money some places, that should be a signal to me that somebody has done due diligence, et cetera, and maybe that's a place where I can put my money in. We've got a real problem though with the pension funds, the PB, particularly the defined benefit. They are going to be under great attack because the states, as their money has diminished, they have trouble paying for them. I mean, they may be one of the victims of this process because you go look and say, can the states afford to pay? State of California, can they afford to pay the teachers and the police money?
But let's not get too entangled just in the details of this one example. Let's remember what the general problem is. The general problem is that one of the main pools of accumulated saving in the world is the pension systems, the public state pension systems.
It's a large fraction.
And that vast amount of capital is almost entirely sterile. It's not serving humanity as it could. So the issue is, by what devices can we imagine mobilizing even a limited part of that vast amount of capital with contained exposure to do this work of transformation, of innovation? It's an empirical issue. It's an experimental issue. There's no reason to be dogmatic. The point is to try out and discover what works.
Yes, sir.
Speaking of what would work on this idea of investing public pension funds, I'm curious just because this is an issue that comes up all the time in law school in different contexts, often in administrative law. Who do you envision making the investment decisions? Because it seems to me you do have a social goal in mind. That's the appeal of the whole idea, is that this is going to be invested socially. But when I hear that, I immediately think, well, who's going to decide which social groups benefit? Who are the...
I mean, remember, I know the trustees of these funds. Actually, we're having a meeting at the law school this next 2 days with the trustees of some of the major funds. They are under fiduciary responsibility, which obviously the big banks are not. So they actually have to sit there and they have to say their first responsibility is to earning enough money that they can pay the pensioners. And that's a very serious kind of limitation. They certainly can put some fraction of money into riskier things, diversified, and that's legitimate. The ERISA and the government rules partly constrain what they can do. But and under the fiduciary responsibility, now I can be corrected by someone who may know better the law than I do. That means the trustees can be liable for things. That's always going to make them more cautious, let's say, than a private venture capital person. And we have to worry about how the rules we want to do for operating them. We also, of course, have larger than the public sector, the defined benefit plans, because defined benefit plans have not been growing. What's been growing has been the defined contribution plans. Actually, I want to be careful. The professor's plan is a defined contribution plan. There is greater opportunities possibly for taking riskier investments if one wants to, because you are responsible for what you do with your defined contribution. The defined benefit is, the responsibility is to pay a certain promised pension to people, and the trustee's responsibility is to make sure that that fund can do that. If I want to risk my private, thing, that's fine. I just don't get the amount of pension that I thought I would otherwise get. So I would sort of amend Roberto's thing to say maybe there should be more interesting things going on in the defined contribution plans as well. They are 3/4 of the pension money at this point.
Yes, but the premise of most of these questions is actually quite different from the example that I was imagining. I'm imagining a huge pension system controlled by the state of a major country. That's what exists in many countries in the world. I'm not thinking of these quasi-private pension funds. I'm thinking of the pension money of the society, of the state, controlled by the state. Then you have 100 teams of technicians, of professional investors and entrepreneurs. And you say, well, take out 5% of this money of the state, and we'll diversify this. And you establish a track record, these 100 different teams, and let's see what works. If you succeed, you'll get more money. If you fail, you'll get less money. And that's really just the logic of the market.
But the Swedes did that with the extra money that they put out, and I don't think you'll find, in the end, the Swedish 100 competing groups were very much venture capital risky. That was not the sense. And
presumably there'll be a spectrum.
Right. But they basically the money's concentrated more and more on the safer things because pensioners sitting there don't want to take these kind of risks.
That depends.
That's
yes, but I'm not thinking of pensioners there. I'm thinking now of the state. So for example,
I'm very leery of that.
No.
Because now it sounds like George Bush wanted to privatize Social Security.
No.
Woof.
No, but it's not privatization.
I know.
Because
but you're trusting the government then.
No, but you're not trusting the government. That's the point. You're saying part of the pension money of society is to be used for the purpose of investment, and the track record will determine how much is used.
I think of the politician. It's going to go to your fund if you contribute to me, and I'd be very, very leery of that.
No, there can't be a discretionary mechanism. That's just the point. There have to be
rules want an absolute
and
rule.
criteria.
It's possible. The last thing, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to make two comments along those lines, actually. There was a book written called The Boulevard of Broken Dreams by HBS professor Josh Lerner on about 20 or 30 economic development and state subsidized and state run. So some state subsidized, some state run venture capital firms in Israel and the Middle East and Europe. And Josh Lerner found that in all but 2 of these 30 funds that there was all kinds of political corruption issues where the government invested the money themselves, or in the case of state subsidized issues where they gave tax credits or some subsidy, that there was a problem with the selection criteria for who runs the funds. So the people who got the subsidies were either related to political connections. They had some selection criteria that was not related to their past investment performance.
Yes.
So how do you structure one of these funds to avoid these problems? And then the second question, actually, or comment, is do we really need more in the way of venture capital money in the U.S.? Because what we saw in 2000 was, in 2000 there was $10 billion invested in U.S. venture capital, which was the most in any year. My background for the last couple of years has been venture capital. And that cohort was the worst performing cohort ever in U.S. venture capital history. It was like a negative 30% return. So there's been arguments that too much money was displaced in 2000 and that perhaps we,
Yes, but
we don't
just
need that
two-
much venture capital money out there.
Yes, but just 2 remarks. First, we all agree that the state should not invest the money directly. But second remark, careful about this argument, because we just said about the BRICS that the ones who had these big public development banks have done much better in response to the crisis than the societies that don't have them.
That's correct.
I had a question about something that Professor Freeman brought up in last lecture about profit sharing with labor. And it got me to thinking about a couple examples in which it had been used. And I thought, of course, of the situation of Enron, where workers were paid with stock and all their value were gone away as a race. So, of course, the scandal came out. And then I thought my own experience working over the summer at Barnes & Noble, like some of my coworkers were paid their 401k in Barnes & Noble stock, but it was so distant that they just didn't really care about it at all. It was like, okay, 4% match in Barnes & Noble stock. The employee handbook says share in our profits, but my coworkers didn't really seem to care. How would you structure it in a way that is really, I guess, relevant to the worker?
I mean,
Disconnected, I think, from.
it's fair enough. The way people in that business talk about it is you've got to give the workers some return that's in their line of sight, not something far off into the future. And the far off into the future kind of stuff, which may have been an ESOP plan that they had at Barnes & Noble. I'm not quite sure how that one worked. Those things do not have all that much incentive things. The Enron, it was the pension fund monies, not the pension fund, but the pension monies in the 401ks that got put in. And it was the executives were telling them to put it in while they were selling their shares because they knew the company was going down. So that's why the Enron people got caught in the criminal, one of the reasons, multiple other reasons they got caught. I think any solution that we want to do, be it pension fund investments through venture capital, government doing something, or profit sharing, they're all going to be fallible, and they're all potentially corruptible. So the question is, you have to build in some kind of safeguard mechanisms so that, and there'll always be a certain fraction of them. We have the best medical system in the world, and we're all going to die, actually. But we can make us live longer and healthier. And we can go to the best doctors in the world, and they can be totally selfless human beings, and they're going to make mistakes. So I think in all of these systems, you have to figure a lot of attention being given to redundancy protections and safeguards, and there will be systems of the best kind that you can envision that will fail, and somebody, and it could be me or it could be somebody else, will say, I know of a failed system. And that shouldn't be taken as the whole thing is wrong. It's a good sign that you got to be careful. You can't, Roberto said, you don't want to buy into a Marxist kind of thing where you believe all the problems get resolved. there are always going to be things
The response,
coming up.
The response to a failed experiment is to have another experiment.
Yeah.
That's what we believe.
We are, oh, one more. Okay, yes, sir. Yeah, we are, but go ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead.
Building off of what you were, something you were saying, Professor Friedman, quite a while ago about localist economic approaches. I wanted to ask you both about what you thought about schemes like community-supported agriculture, the Berkshire movement in Western Massachusetts, or other solidarity economies in terms of this type of experimentation, and also sort of assuming success like CSA has had lately in the last 20 years. What's the next step? What do you do with the successful alternative?
Yeah, I mean, there's two kinds of things that get built up in recessions. One, sometimes you have certain kinds of groups that do sort of barter things. That was big in Argentina in their crisis. It was in the UK. We had some things when I was in Britain. Those things generally die off in a short period of time. They're helpful. You can't get credit any place. You can't get things. You sort of recreate some small system. So, but then if you think about more things that have more legs, or broader things. I don't know the particulars you mentioned. You know, you've had credit associations that have done well for years. You've had different kinds of co-ops. They don't die. They've never grown to be a large fraction of the society. I would like to think of them as connected with what I call the shared capitalist kind of things, the same type of institutions. And if you sort of think very broadly of a whole spectrum of them, they actually have grown in the capitalist system. And so as part of that overall experimentation and process, they're part of what I think has really been a reasonably successful, growth thing. And that's, you hope that with more, there's a policy question that I don't know what the answer to is, which is a big issue, is do we want to encourage them by giving them taxpayer dollars, giving them tax breaks of some sort? I know we certainly want to give them the same tax break we give hedge fund guys, but really the right thing is to take away the tax break from the hedge funds. I'm not sure you want to give the companies that are doing this, their workers are generally better off than the others, and so you're taking money from normal workers who are not in such a great shape. That one I find it very difficult, to make a decision whether Treasury should privilege, say, John Lewis in the United Kingdom, which they don't at this point. But should they, in order to encourage more companies like that? Well, you're giving money to the better off, and that's I think a tough issue to decide.
Finished?
I'm done.
So first, I want to thank Richard Friedman for his entirely anomalous openness to fundamental reconsiderations. Aristotle remarks in the Nicomachean Ethics that a single sparrow does not make spring, but he was mistaken. And second, I want to thank all of you for your engagement and your patience. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Awesome. That's good.
Good.
Yeah, no, this is